Oh boy, today is going to be an interesting one, and a topic that's a little off the beaten path for what the channel normally deals with. Suggested by one of the channel's patrons, this video topic is going to be covering mercenaries in science fiction. More specifically, the conditions, requirements, and political state needed for mercenaries to even exist in the first place, as well as going over how they rise, what they do, how they act, and finally, why it's extremely unlikely or outright impossible for mercs to exist in any meaningful way across the vast majority of science fiction universes. Thanks to the guy who suggested I talk about this, by the way, since it turned out to be a surprisingly fun topic to research. But first, if you enjoy the video, consider leaving a like, subscribe, ring the bell, all that, since it really does help a smaller channel like this fight the YouTube algorithm when we make more niche content. If you're feeling generous though, check out our Patreon and buy me a coffee, or hang out in the channel Discord with fellow turbo nerds and sci-fi enjoyers. Everything linked in the video description below. And with that out of the way, the topic of the day. We're going to start with a hefty section dealing with real life, so get ready for Sci to talk about history and current events. Oh boy. Contrary to what most people think, mercenaries are a very rare and infrequent thing, both in science fiction and in real life. Most people would immediately disagree and point to the countless examples of armies across history that used foreign troops and auxiliaries, like the Carthaginians, Chinese, medieval Europe, and more. However, mercenaries are not just people who fight for money and aren't affiliated with someone. They are, at least in my mind, a very specific type of soldier of fortune, one which presents a huge number of benefits and boons, but are extremely dangerous and are rarely, if ever, trusted, and thus rarely if ever used. The perfect example from history is the Landsknecht, arguably the most infamous mercenaries of all time, at least until Wagner from the Russia-Ukraine war supplanted them in the public consciousness. The Landsknecht were in many ways their own unique entity. While they were originally founded by the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian, these mercenaries were based off of the Swiss, the Rheinslaufer. My god, I butchered that word. With heavy rows of pike or poleaxe-wielding foot soldiers in the front ranks and musket or arquebus-wielding gunmen protected in the center of a square formation. These mercenaries had no loyalty to anyone but themselves first, and money second, and despite being founded by a Holy Roman Empire, would go on to fight for every side in pretty much every conflict in Europe at the era, all the way from the southern ends of France to the northern ends of Poland, and even all the way onto the Isle of Britain itself. They did not give a shit who they were fighting for, only that they were getting paid. They were also infamous for switching sides before a battle, and sometimes mid-battle in active betrayal if offered a better deal by an opponent. They also commonly raided and sacked the cities they were housed in if contracts or payments slowed or were missed. It didn't matter that they were employed by a given noble or faction. If they thought it was a bad deal, they would simply just leave, and, well, sometimes they would steal everything and then leave, but for the most part they would just piss off. Not to mention, they also carried around another, small armies worth of prostitutes and workers behind them for the service and pleasure of the fighting men. Now, you might be wondering, why? If they were generally unreliable and extremely unruly, why would so many people be willing to pay absolute top dollar for their services? Because they were brutal and unbelievably violent while shifting any losses or blowback onto random people no one had ever heard of, rather than the citizens at home you would otherwise have had to conscript. The Landsknecht, however, they proved to be some of the best mercenaries by brutally butchering and mauling their enemies, to the point where atrocities and war crimes before it was cool was pretty much an every battle occurrence. You will be the best merc when all your competition is dead. So hiring them on, despite the risk, would often mean the guarantee of extremely well-fought battles. They also usually brought enough men to decisively turn the numbers advantage towards the hiring side more often than not. However, it is important to mention, this is an insane amount of power on the battlefields of the day. Like, this mercenary group could most likely win pitched battles against proper official armies of the era, like fighting France and winning, as an example. And to a lot of people, that immediately rings an alarm. Hold on a second, there is a massively powerful, extremely violent, morally bankrupt force that's entire skill set is killing armies. And they are currently within arm's reach of a king, noble, or someone else of high importance that they could steal from or ransom off. Why would you ever ever hire them as a person in a position of political influence or power? Well, the reality is they didn't really have a choice. You see, this is what real mercenaries are. In order to actually fight on a battlefield and win against peer enemies, or at least be useful, mercenaries need to be as or nearly as powerful as those peer militaries would be. Stuff like BlackRock, another quote-unquote mercenary organization, isn't really. Calling them security contractors is more accurate, since they're essentially just trumped up thugs with guns and the go-ahead from their home nation to commit war crimes and shoot civilians while manning outposts and running security detail for people. But for proper mercenaries that a faction is intending to use in actual open combat, that isn't the case. Wagner similarly was equipped with everything from tanks, artillery, fire support, and advanced anti-air systems. I don't think they ever used fixed-wing or rotary aircraft, but they did use the entire arsenal and support infrastructure of modern ground combat. And once the situation got really bad for them, they pulled a mercenary classic, turned traitor, and Prigozhin made a fucking run on Moscow. That right there is a real mercenary force. The whole package. War crimes, lack of loyalty, extreme violence, and a willingness to commit atrocities just as casually as they breathe. That's why I said real mercenaries haven't really existed in huge numbers or for very long periods of time in real life, because for as useful as they can be, they are a massive problem and threat just sitting there. It's like a landmine. It's waiting to go off if you step on it accidentally. And if you don't have a monopoly on violence, you do not have a monopoly on loyalty, no matter what anyone on either side of that mercenary contract may claim. So they generally need three things in order to thrive. First is political and social desperation. In an age of war like the 1500s to 1700s in Europe, the various nations were in constant turmoil at risk of foreign invasion, domestic treachery, and civil war or scheming rivals. Pretty much every nation at the time was fighting 1,000 different battles at all times and was thus constantly hungry for men and materiel. In this kind of situation, many kings and nobles are more than willing to pay for loyalty and fighting potential to supplement their own levies. Even if it's a huge risk, it's still one that they're desperate and often unable to refuse. This also contributed to social breakdown and desperation, where generations of people were leading unstable shit lives at constant risk of someone coming in and burning down their town or village while fighting the resident noble landlord of the day. Second condition is open coffers and ready blacksmiths, or something like that. Mercenaries are distinctly separate from more standard national armies. They don't have the massive logistics and manufacturing infrastructure to create and field their own weapons. They also often don't have the capital in order to outright purchase the most powerful gear from anybody who's actually selling and producing it. So they rely on the resources of the people they're hired by to let them buy weapons at a discount or just give it to them in general. Without that, it's highly unlikely that they would ever be truly able to arm and equip themselves for combat. And the third requirement that mercenaries need to become really prevalent is scale. A few people willing to fight for money are just thugs. A few dozen or a few hundred are gangs or criminal organizations at best. Thousands or tens of thousands? Now that's a right proper mercenary organization, as they're bringing an actually scary amount of firepower and men to bear on any given engagement. So with all that covered, the actual science fiction portion of the story, moving on from some lovely real-life history and stuff for the last, 10 minutes. We see numerous examples of settings where mercenaries range from smaller side factions or plot-irrelevant foes to massive core parts of the setting's lore, appeal, and enjoyment. To start with, I'm going to cover a few factions that many people think of as mercenaries but really aren't. They're closer to bounty hunters, criminals, or hitmen than they are true mercenary fighting forces. First on the chopping block are Mandalorians from Star Wars. They are not mercenaries, never have been, and were probably not intended to be. Hitmen for hire, bounty hunters, bodyguards, and infiltrators or saboteurs? Oh, absolutely. But as a cohesive force, mercenaries, they are not. Firstly, Mandalorians have, or at least had, a central state, a strong cultural and governing system that was capable of bringing most, if not all, of the Mandalorian clans together during the accurately named Mandalorian Wars. After multiple major defeats and having the source of their cultural unity stolen or lost, they dissolved back into their clans, families, and groups that went their separate ways. Even groups we see like the Death Watch aren't really mercenaries, even though they fight for one of the various larger factions during the Clone Wars, since they're motivated by ideology, and we see they have other motivators besides money that are more important and that they're willing to die for. Can Mandalorians on an individual or small group level be mercs? Oh, absolutely. You can pay them to join your private army, no problem. But are they as a whole, or are they as an organization prepared to provide mercenaries and armies? No, they are not. The only real mercenary armies that I think exist in Star Wars, as far as I know, are the criminal hordes implied by the Hutt cartels. All the classic hallmarks: unscrupulous, amoral, in it for the money only, and disloyal to a fault, living in a rough, chaotic, and often unstable region of gangs and warlords, and supplied with ships, weapons, and resources by a much more powerful patron, often their Hutt. One thing I will note is that when the Empire took over, some of the first things they did was kill off all the Mandalorians, take over Mandalore, as well as convincingly dominating Hutt space, since those were the two most likely areas to organize large-scale force against them. Moving on, while Star Wars has the Hutts, one of my patrons suggested Mass Effect and things like the Blood Pack, Eclipse, and Blue Suns as being mercenary armies. I would also disagree that they're mercenaries. They might call themselves that and operate in small numbers for guns as hire, but they're definitively unwanted, untolerated, and independent criminal organizations that operate on a relatively small scale. No one is coming to hire their services out to fight their wars. No Turian or Asari is going to head over and hire out a few tens of thousands of them to invade a world alongside their official national military to beef up their forces. What we do see is members of these groups cloistered away on stations and planets that are off the beaten path, and generally far enough away from the major powers' prying eyes that they won't be curb-stomped back into the dirt by the Systems Alliance or Turian hierarchy. The closest Mass Effect comes to having actual mercenaries would be the Batarians, but even then it's a bit of a stretch. Their home systems are entirely isolated from the rest of the Citadel species, and generally all we see are the pirate gangs, smugglers, and criminals that have fled their home systems and instead infested the Terminus cluster. Theoretically, these could be mercenaries if you manage to unite them together and wield them as one coherent force, but it's both highly unlikely and also impractical, as they don't have the weapons or ships necessary to really be a fighting force. Even if you got them all on side and fighting the same enemy, they would most likely be crushed by a standard battle fleet from any of the major powers, since they don't have the backing and weapons supply from a major force like the Batarian state to take a hit or suffer a defeat and keep on going in future battles. One setting that does most definitively have mercenaries is Battletech, and here we see every example that I talked about earlier come about in force. The Great Houses are in a constant state of war and have been for hundreds of years. Countless worlds on the borders of these states are constantly under threat and have no prospects of advancing their lives or having a better future. Hatred and mistrust are at an all-time high, with entire generations of people willing to join up with the army or mercenary bands to escape their shit-nothing lives, or for the simple reason that they just really want to kill the people they don't like, and the prevalence of weapons and supplies is so ubiquitous that if you're a good mercenary, or you at least know where the black markets are, you may never need to buy anything again, or just simply steal everything from your deceased targets. Battletech has multiple mercenary armies like the real world's Lands Connect, dozens or hundreds of mech warriors split into multiple units using air power and armored vehicles and infantry to support their divisions, and all of which that fights and operates separately for hire and for pay. Often entirely amoral and willing to take on almost any contract, from demolishing a school, killing political rivals, stealing resources, or committing false flag operations. And to top it off, with how much fighting is going on and how unstable most of the Great Houses can often be, most of the various major players are willing to shill out the big bucks and weapons to get mercs to go fight and die against pirates, rebels, and invasions, rather than spending the time, money, and effort to get their proper military to go do it, because it's both a cheaper and faster solution for them. Most importantly though, the mercs in Battletech operate on a massive scale, enough so that it's possible to hire entire armies of mercenaries capable enough to stop a planetary invasion from another great house. they are a colossal fighting force that easily augments the militaries of the other great houses in the way that we see from things like the Condottieri or the Landsknecht. And that covers some examples from sci-fi of not mercenaries and totally mercenaries, but why? Why only some settings? Why don't soldiers of fortune show up in every sci-fi setting? Well, the simple reason is they simply can't. Let's look at Star Trek for an example. There pretty much aren't any mercenaries in that universe operating at any large scale because they can't. The Romulans would never use them for more than a suicide run because they're paranoid little buggers that would never tolerate the threat of betrayal. The Klingons might, but it's more than likely they would use them for basically target practice and would butcher them for honor's sake, then incorporate their decimated forces and worlds into the Empire proper. And the Federation would absolutely take a moral grandstand against them while not needing them to begin with, as Starfleet is a huge, extremely centrally controlled and highly powerful force. Even more villainous factions like the Dominion wouldn't use them since their whole thing is being a hegemonic empire with no room for dissent. The political and social climate is simply not there to allow mercenaries to be used, and factions like the Borg, well, they very obviously don't use mercenaries for a pretty in-your-face reason, I think we can say. Star Wars is roughly similar in that most of the time fighting is happening, it's titanic empires slugging it out across dozens or hundreds of star systems with deeply institutionalized and highly professional forces. Even the Rebel Alliance, while it most definitely did use mercenary armies and hired on bounty hunters and smugglers to do a lot of their work for them, was primarily a volunteer force politically motivated towards regime change and an ideological bent. And this brings us to the crux of the issue. Science fiction is simply anathema to mercenaries, since for the most part, in order to get to that level of advancement and scale, you need a coordinated push from an entire unified species or federation, something that isn't going to be built on mistrust or fear, and wouldn't allow for the benefits of mercenaries to outweigh the risks. Another huge issue is that as science fiction advances along, it becomes infinitely harder for mercs to actually arm themselves. Take The Expanse, for example. The only faction that would likely even create or use mercenaries would be the Belters, but the powers that be, Mars and Earth, hold the facilities and dockyards needed to produce ships and weapons with an iron grip. We see the very best the Belters can cobble together is essentially strapping a few dozen old, last-generation torpedoes on the outside of a ship or stacked up in the cargo bay of a converted hauler. Even point defense weapons are rare on their ships, and railguns are pretty much entirely unheard of, and none of the other factions would ever allow their tech and weapons to fall into mercenary hands, at least before the Ringgate fiasco and all of that. And really, that's why mercenaries are so rare in science fiction. Most of the time, civilizations are pretty good, pretty stable, pretty decent places to live and grow, so very few people feel the need or pressure to turn to more unscrupulous methods of making a living. Technology and industry is so far past what mercs can get their hands on that there's no real way for them to fight and win against peer enemies of the era, and the powers that be don't see any value in the benefits of allowing mercenaries to exist and using their services over their own citizens compared to the potential downsides and worst case scenario of rebellion or betrayal. That's why they're so rare. They're almost exclusively found in settings where everything is shit, there's no central control or strong state, violence is, in large amounts, desperately needed, and weapons are easy to get your hands on. And that pretty much concludes the video. A little more historical than Sci's normal brand would suggest, but this was a really fun topic to talk about, and I hope whichever patron wanted this is reasonably satisfied with the result. Before we end off though, a huge thanks to the aforementioned channel patrons. Your support is greatly appreciated and goes a long way on the back end, with a special thanks to the members of the $5 tier. David G, the original, Augie, 11 Bravo Crunchy, Terry Higgins, Pedro Munaz, David G, the other one, Silencer, Vox Apollyon, Phoenix, BT Legend, Electroboy 11, Logan Maynard, Mickey, David Armand, Creedome, Robin Stoppit, Fenrir Striker, Tachi Tukane, He's Deb, Pixie, Vertus, Fabric 445, Anchovy Bob, Mini Crustacean, Charles the Snap, Polly, Eric Jones, Joseph Holiday, Zombie the Zerker, David B, Sweet B, Rastro, Le Butcher, Stabby Taco, Namquam, Brian Hall, Joshua J. Lee, John Gabrielle, The Hay Fork, Unit 0, Tarly Bob, Douglas Jerema, Kiwi Warrior, Jason Vigo, Screaming Stuka, Darius, Exothermic Reaction, Roscoe 292, and And the new guy, Christoph Grimberg. Thank you very much for all your support. It is greatly appreciated. I hope it'll continue in the future. And with that, the video is functionally over. Outros are hard. Goodbye.